mentioned, I'm originally from Turkey, but I have been studying earthquakes in California for almost 25 years. And it all started with the 1999 earthquake that killed, what they say, 17,000 people at the time. And that really motivated me to become an earthquake engineer. And again, naively I thought, if I study it, it will fix itself. Apparently it doesn't. And I hope my presentation today and all the following presentations today motivate you to continue doing what you're doing, but also think about how this is going to impact the real lives of people who are affected by these earthquakes. I work at the Applied Technology Council. Our focus is on technology transfer. We take research and we make sure that practitioners can use it. We work with governments to make sure they have seismic retrofit programs to implement it. But again, it's not fixed yet, right? So there's a lot of work to do, and I hope what you're going to see today, what you're going to learn from all of these earthquakes, will ground you in for the work that you're doing. Today I'm going to give you a perspective from a structural engineer's perspective. A geotechnical engineer isn't able to be with us today, so there isn't going to be much geotechnical or ground motion information, but a lot about the engineering practice in Turkey. I hope you're all familiar with the earthquake by now. It is now over 6 months ago. 2 major earthquakes occurred in Turkey on known seismic zones. And Turkey is the place where history and cultures and religions have been coming together for millennia, and it's also where plates come together. When plates come together, they have a little party, and all of these dots are historical seismicity, over 5.5 in the last 100 years. So it's a really seismically active place. These 2 earthquakes, the 7.8 and 9 hours later, the 7.8 and the 7.5 that followed, caused major amounts of damage, and you've all seen this in the news. The official numbers are still around 50,000 casualties, $100 billion damage, and to be honest, this number really sounds low to me. If 230,000 buildings were damaged, and almost all of these are 5-story apartment buildings, say 2 units per piece, that is more than 50,000 casualties that one should expect, but this is the official number. And again, once you see the damage and the extent of it, heavy damage is practically a collapse, and it would be really hard to get out of that if this happened to your apartment at 4 a.m. There's a lot of reports that are coming out, and this is a snapshot of the earlier reports. The Turkish universities published a lot of reports. The Turkish Ministry of Strategy, there's a report that came out exactly 30 days later, and that's the one that seems to be collecting all of the official data. We worked closely with STEER to prepare a virtual reconnaissance report, and GEAR, that is the Geotechnical Earthquake Events Reconnaissance Team, to bring together all of our findings from the field. Since then, there are other reports that are coming out. I recently read a report by Build Change. If you're interested more in the process of things in Turkey, that is a really good resource. And of course, many papers are currently coming into different journals and to conferences for your review. Another one that I would like to put on your to watch list is that the ACI 133 committee spent over 2 weeks on the field with about 24 engineers and researchers taking measurements of the different buildings. So that might be a very interesting database for you to refer to in your research in the future. The earthquake affected 13 cities in Turkey. That's actually equivalent to about 13% of the Turkey population. There were 280 ground motion stations in the region. So it is a very well documented earthquake. For the ground motion information, you still have to refer to the Turkish websites. The Turkish equivalent of FEMA there is sharing their data still. And I'm going to show you now information about the structural damage. The typical construction in Turkey is a reinforced concrete moment frame with unreinforced masonry infill, and the masonry is also hollow clay tile. And most of the buildings, more than 37% of the households in the affected regions were built prior to 2000. And you're going to see why that time is very important. One very important thing the EERI team did on the field was that they visited post-2000 buildings that were moderately or heavily damaged to look at them and to start collecting some data about what are some typical damage patterns in these buildings. And they looked at 91 residential buildings. One of the pictures you'll see later is that in Turkey, or in these regions of Turkey, there isn't really a commercial downtown that is full of shiny skyscrapers. A lot of the commercial regions are the original centers of the town, so the commerce happens on the first floor of an apartment building, or an entire apartment building is full of, lawyers' offices and travel agencies, so everything almost looks like a residential building. So the damage that they identified, primarily rebar buckling, plastic hinging, diagonal cracking. These are the most commonly observed damage that they saw in buildings that were still standing. And here's some examples of that damage. This building that is vertical on the side has a big Y on it, because that building, all of the columns on the first floor had buckled, and the Y indicates yıkım, which is demolition. So this building was slated for demolition, and actually the government has been pretty fast in demolishing these buildings. The one in the middle is actually the only time we saw a short column damage. Another one in the middle with the leaning, with the leaning here is one. I think it's a picture perfect P delta situation over there. This slide was provided to me by Dr. Günay and Dr. Masalam, and what they've done is that they've taken the ground motion at one of the sites in Turkey, in Gaziantep, and has a PGV of 108 centimeters per second and an acceleration of 0.9 g. And they're comparing it to what is expected. What's the expected response of a Turkish type of reinforced concrete frame building? And as expected, the buildings were collapsed. And here they're overlaying it with how they think a California non-compliant building would do. So there's been a lot of news about what this type of earthquake would do to California. And it's one of those things, right? You don't want to alarm everybody and say run out of all of your older concrete buildings, but the older concrete buildings clearly pose a danger to the population in this highly seismic area. And again, if you've been following the news, Southern California, Los Angeles, West Hollywood, there's a couple jurisdictions that have enacted seismic ordinances for retrofitting their non-ductile concrete buildings. And then the city of San Francisco is considering establishing one as well. And why is this so important? These are the pictures that really bring it home for me. This is, I believe, our second day on the field. We got out of the car and we said, okay, this is what it looks like. It's just rubble. And we just walked through it, right? By day 2, by day 3, you become a little desensitized to it. At this point, you're just kind of complaining about the dust, and you kind of forget what used to be there. So this, I would say, was the most striking moment for me, and this actually happened at my desktop in California when we said, okay, here's the picture we took, what did it look like before? So what we were looking at was used to be a commercial hub. There's people living in these buildings, there's people working in these buildings, and it is now all gone. Similarly, here's a shopping area where, likely on a Tuesday afternoon, people were doing their afternoon shopping, and this is what we saw. And with this picture, I also want to highlight the importance of thinking beyond just your own building. What if you are the owner or the resident of this only building in the block that did not collapse? What does it mean for your street, for your neighborhood, for your commercial area that, again, you survived, but all of your neighbors' buildings collapsed? It doesn't mean that that life can go back on for you. With all this damage, another thing to think about is critical facilities, the story of 4 hospitals. We drove in Kahramanmaraş and we visited 4 hospitals in one day. The first one is a city hospital, second one is a private hospital, and the third and the fourth one are on the outskirts where they were trying to consolidate health services, and they were next to each other. So the city hospital actually looked pretty old from the outside, but we were able to talk with the director, and he said that they were able to continue operations, no damage. They lost some power. All their generators came online. And then after the second aftershock, the 7.5, at this point the staff ran away. They said, I'm not staying here. But luckily, a professor who was from the area came back to the city, did a quick survey of the building, and told them that they could continue operations. So again, they only lost a couple hours of operations and were able to serve their community. Meanwhile, a couple blocks down in the center of town was a private hospital that we walked by, and this had lost an entire story. On the outskirts of town, we walked through a construction site of a new hospital, and this hospital is being constructed with base isolators, and since 2017, the government has been requiring the use of base isolators in large public hospitals. And in this, it's only a construction site, but of course they had no damage. Even the scaffolding, they had no damage in this case. However, next door, it was a hospital that was constructed only 10 years ago. And it looked really good from the outside, but it had major non-structural damage inside. Well, actually, I'll take that back. It had non-structural damage on the inside. So ceiling tiles fallen, some atrium, fancy veneer falling off the walls. And we had been warned about this hospital by the other doctors, saying, doctors won't go in because the walls are falling. It's just the architectural veneer. That said, they did have a fire in their mechanical room. So this is day 10 after the earthquake, and this pretty new hospital was not functioning. Even worse, we went to see the water supply. After the earthquake, immediately they lost power from the main, so they did not have water from the main for about 6 days, in which case they should be relying on their water tanks. However, the water tank sloshed, hit a column on this side, the wall on the other side, and they lost all of their water. So even if the hospital had been able to work, you cannot run a hospital without hygiene. So day 10 following the earthquake, this newer hospital was operating out of the field. And this is similar to what we observed kind of driving by other hospitals as well. Hospital looks good from a drive-by, but there's a field hospital. And we wondered why. The ERI hospitals team answered this for us. They actually intentionally went to hospitals, and they found out that so many of them were not functioning following an earthquake. So this is not a structural damage classification. These are whether the hospitals were functioning or not. Because according to the reports, there was only, I believe, 1, maybe 2 hospital collapses. No other major damage, structural damage was reported, yet the hospitals were not functioning. Again, what's the point of a hospital if it is not working after the earthquake when you have injured people? Lifelines, just like hospitals, is a very critical part of a community. And I keep showing this quote from the EFIT team. Hatay had its bones broken in pieces. This is the old city that was heavily damaged. It's a really historical city, and they lost power, they lost water, they lost their hospital, and nobody could come help them for a long time. And here's an example of why. The fire station collapsed on top of the fire trucks. So luckily, the firemen who were running into their trucks, their lives were saved because the trucks held up the building that was collapsing. But now they lost 3 fire trucks. That is what you need to respond to an earthquake. So let's put all of it in context of the Turkish earthquake code. I think there's probably a lot of interest in that. This is actually from that really collapsed city that I was showing earlier. That one building that is standing in the middle of the rubble is the Chamber of Civil Engineers. So this is similar to ASCE in Turkey. And there was a lot of pictures of this, in the news, of course. Engineers design their own buildings better. The news kind of neglected that 2 blocks over was the architect's chamber. So apparently architects also design their own buildings better. Turkey has had a earthquake code since 1975. It's always an evolution, of course. This is from a recent paper that came out from a professor in Istanbul Technical University that I found very helpful. And what they are doing is that they are tracking the code and its impact on actual design over the years. And one of the things you can highlight here easily is the reinforcement. You know, is it deformed or not, right? Smooth bars was a major problem in the 1999 earthquake. Until 2007, it still was. Because it takes a while for code enforcement to trickle down. They also did some review of the stirrup spacing. So as you might remember, confinement was a main damage mode in the structures that we observed. So the stirrups used to be at 30 centimeters. And they're also looking at what the spectral acceleration capacity of a code design building is over the years based on, you know, following through the different design codes. So everything is getting better, everything is improving, yet there is a really large body of existing buildings, right? All of those are in danger. Now quickly, another important factor in Turkey was responsibility. Where does it lie? The designers are civil engineers, yet there is no professional engineering license requirement in Turkey, and any graduate out of a 4-year program can design 3 buildings a year. One could say even with a PhD, perhaps you should not be designing 3 buildings a year immediately, right? You need to learn how to do it. You need to apprentice. And what kind of tools do they have? They have package programs that you put in the architectural drawings and it spits out where your walls and your columns should go. And I quote our friend Ashraf here. He says, why was the name SAP selected for his nonlinear analysis tool? It was selected to remind the user that this program, like all computer programs, lacks intelligence. It's the responsibility of the engineer to idealize the structure correctly and assume responsibility for the results. So machine learning, you know, all these cool things we're talking about, all these models, it still comes down to you to be able to make sure that it's the right thing for the right building. There's also no oversight, and the responsibility lays eventually with the developer. This guy in the middle with the Guinness World Record winning golden scissors with the checkered, you know, jacket, they were trying to arrest him for designing these awful buildings, and he was like, what, me? No, I had nothing to do with that. So Turkey has been arresting developers, but they're also, you know, that is not going to change the way things are done. What's next? Many people have been displaced. 3 million, housing for 3 million people was affected in the earthquake, which led to immigration, like people left the town. And this is one way I've been tracking it. Immediately after the earthquake, 2 weeks after the earthquake, they placed 100,000 students in different schools. And by May, only about a third of them had come back to their original schools. So that should give you a sense of who's coming back and who's not. There's a little bit of insurance help. There was about 55% coverage. However, you know, as you can imagine, that's not going to cover everybody's losses. Rebuilding is going really fast. Quality of it, or whether it's being, the rebuilding is done with proper care and urban planning and structural design remains to be seen. So, thank you for your attention. That's all my time.